Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Sunday, it's November 17th. Today is day 408. I'm back in Jerusalem. What news can I share with you on this 408th day of war as people continue to die by the dozens? There were 3 Israeli airstrikes in central and northern Gaza overnight into this Sunday morning. His Holiness Pope Francis of the Catholic Church has called for an investigation to determine if the Israeli attacks in Gaza might constitute genocide, according to excerpts that have been released from an upcoming new book. At least 43,846 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th of last year. That's in Gaza alone. Beirut continues to be bombed. Children growing up throughout the occupied Palestinian territories only know the realities of Israelis as settlers or soldiers. And rockets continue to be fired from Lebanon at Israel, from Israel to Gaza, and from Israel to Lebanon, Syria, and other places where there are Iranian-backed militias. So what in the world does peace mean in such a catastrophe? What does liberation mean? What does freedom mean in a context like this kind of war, death, and violence, with mass civilian casualties and trauma in the Middle East? Today was the final day of our And Still We Rise summit. It's our women's summit in Jericho. It's Sunday. Normally on Sundays, I do a spiritual reflection. And I thought I'd talk just a little bit about some of the things we wrestled through this weekend as a group of women, predominantly women. We spent, the first day had men with us, and then the next 2 days were women only. We spent the first, the whole time, I hope, going before God, but the first 2 days, we asked questions about what it means to pursue health and transformation, our assumption being that one has to have internal peace within our own souls before we can aid or seek to process or move forward in the context of community and seeking peace in the broader world. And we asked not only what does it mean to have peace within ourselves, but then peace within our own families, and then peace within the context of our communities. And today we started to wrestle with what does that look like within our broader societies in the context of our quest for equality and human rights. And so we had a human rights expert lead us through a whole morning where we wrestled with what are the human rights challenges in the occupied territories? And then we opened up the scriptures and we looked at what are the passages that talk to us about freedom and liberation. We played a little game where we had different groups and we set a timer and said, who can come up with the most Bible verses that have to do with justice and liberation and freedom? And some of the groups found these like pre-curated lists with dozens of passages that had to do with justice. And I said that was cheating, but there are hundreds and hundreds of verses in the scripture. Jesus' very first sermon in Luke chapter 4, where Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor, freedom for the captives, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. And we talked about how that freedom, that justice, that liberation is both for the soul, that it is a spiritual liberation, but also a physical liberation, a liberation from physical poverty, from physical prison. So we worked together to define what does liberation look like: spiritual liberation, existential in our souls or spirits, and physical liberation, a material freedom. Freedom from occupation, freedom from violence, freedom from oppression. One can be free in one's spirit and not in one's body, and vice versa. One can be physically free and their soul can still be held captive. Think about the verses where Jesus said in Matthew chapter 28, verse 10, do not be afraid of those who can kill the body, but not kill the soul. Thus, Christ differentiated between spiritual freedom and physical freedom. We also talked about what does collective liberation look like, and whether or not the scriptures teach that God calls all humanity, all people, to be spiritually and physically free. In general, in the room, the consensus was yes, of course. The invitation to freedom is for everyone. Oppression exists, and when those freedoms and liberties are limited in some way, shape, or form, that's what oppression means, and all people should be free. And then we talked about that's collective liberation. And that all seemed very constructive until it got down to the nitty-gritty. What does that actually mean? And what's that mean for a population living under occupation and oppression? Not only now, not only in the midst of a genocide in Gaza, not only in the midst of ethnic cleansing, but for decades, for a long-term period of time. The room included a very diverse group of women, theologically, ecumenically, from different denominations, but also in terms of age and demographics. And also when you think about geographic space. So we had West Bank Palestinians that have certain realities living under occupation. We had Jerusalemites that have certain privileges, being able to go back and forth between Israel and the occupied, East Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank. We had Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship from Nazareth and other parts of Galilee. There are different, that's part of the reality of Palestinian societies. It's so fragmented that Palestinians, even within their own culture and society, have different privileges amongst themselves. Very, very different perspectives in this conversation about collective liberation. And in light of the conversation we had today, I thought I would just read a couple of excerpts. This is from a chapter from Evangelical Theologies of Liberation and Justice. InterVarsity published this book. This is from a chapter that I wrote called Strange Freedom. That title comes from Howard Thurman, a Black theologian who wrote about liberation. The title of the chapter is Strange Freedom, Liberation for the Sake of Others, where I do a comparison of Howard Thurman's teachings, Martin Luther King Jr., and also some of the teachings of the Palestinian liberation theologian Naim Atik, among others. This is what I wrote. Liberation is not a foreign concept to evangelical traditions and theology. Jesus spoke in his own teachings as leading to liberation. If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples, and then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That's from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verses 31 and 32. In the times of the New Testament, before those times in the Hebrew scriptures, God is described as the one who liberates. And teachings of liberation permeate throughout the Pentateuch, the wisdom literature, the writings of the prophets. One of the most famous stories of liberation is told in the story of the Israelites and how Moses led God's people out of slavery from Egypt towards the promised land. For God commanded Moses and said, leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, go up to the land that I promised on an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the story of Exodus. It's a story of liberation. Leviticus, a book of the law, describes the year of Jubilee as one that God commanded. Leviticus 25:10 says, consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all of its inhabitants. Leviticus 25 is the passage that Jesus was referring to when he preached his very first sermon in Luke chapter 4. Liberty and freedom was expressed as the goal of the year of Jubilee. Psalm 119 speaks of how obedience to the decrees of God leads to liberation. I will walk about in freedom, for I have sought out the precepts of God. That's Psalm 119. Christians throughout history have proclaimed a message of the good news, that the evangelical, that's where evangelicalism comes from. I can't say the Latin word. That the person of Christ came to set the captives free from personal sin and depravity. That's the idea. And also the physical yokes of oppression. God is the one who brings freedom, freedom from sin, Acts 13:39, and from the powers of evil that manifest themselves in material poverty, but also physical limitations. And we see Christ's care exemplified in the work of his ministry as he healed the sick, Matthew 4:23. He blessed the poor, Luke 6:20. He fed the hungry, John 6:11. He comforted the sorrowful, Matthew 5:4. He walked alongside those who were most excluded from society in Mark 2:15. The good news of Christ sheds profound wisdom on the question of theological freedom, both in the spiritual and the material world. Consider Jesus' response to the woman who was crippled for 18 years, to the woman who was bent over by her infirmity. Jesus said, woman, you are set free from your infirmity. So on touching her, she straightened up and then she praised God in Luke chapter 13. Christ set her free. I hope these passages of liberation and justice give us just a little bit of hope to some who are living under such oppression and injustice. Maybe in your soul, or in your marriage, or in your family, or in a physical illness, or in Palestine. The Palestinian Christian context, which Naim Atik talks about in his liberation theology, must daily ask what it means to practice within contextual theology, a theology that responds to the needs of the soul and the harsh circumstances of military occupation. A part of the daily reality of Palestinians living in the occupied Palestinian territories is the use of the military weight of Israel to exert control and power, and now daily death and violence. The Israeli state regularly, for decades, has exacted oppression, exploitation, and dependence on the Palestinian people. And the words to describe those atrocities committed over the last 14 months, they escape me. There are no words to describe it other than evil. Community infrastructure in Palestine, the healthcare, the education systems, they're all affected by the realities of occupation. The result is substandard healthcare, a state system of education that relies on external funding sources. I could go on and on and on. Mitri Rahab, I've talked about him before, says, I'm a Palestinian living under Israeli occupation, and my captor daily seeks to make my life harder for me. He encircles my people with barbed wire. He builds walls around us, and his army sets many boundaries around us. He succeeds in keeping thousands of us in camps and prisons. Palestinians today live in the occupied territories, and they understand more than many in many parts of the world what it means to live in the absence of material freedom. So in addition to the pursuit of social liberation, Christian Palestinians are wrestling. I mean, this is part of the conversation we had today. How does that shape their identity as they seek both existential and material freedom? I just want to give you a couple more quotes before I close. Jean Zaru, I've had the privilege of spending some time with her. She's a Quaker, an incredible Palestinian woman known for her involvement in Palestinian human rights. She says, despite the current Israeli government's determination, no amount of its violence could subjugate the will of a people or destroy their spirit as they struggle for their freedom, dignity, and their right to sovereignty on their own land. Although the Palestinian people experience physical oppression and are in active pursuit of material freedom, a person's spirit and personal will cannot be contained. Instead, the Christian community in Palestine possesses a hope that is beyond description. Zaru writes of this hope. Sometimes we try to look for a hope in what seems to be a hopeless situation. But if there's a hope after such a brutal death of the resurrected Jesus Christ, then there is surely no situation that is devoid of hope and promise. I think that's so powerful. I'm going to read it again. Sometimes we try to look for a hope in what seems to be a hopeless situation. But if there can be hope after such a brutal death, such as the resurrection, a hope after the brutal death of the resurrected Christ, if there's hope in that, then there's hope here. There's no situation that's devoid of hope and promise. This hope and promise make it clear that individuals and communities can experience the liberation of soul, even in the midst of the struggle for material freedom, even in the midst of occupation. That's what I hear Zaru writing. She lives in Ramallah. Within societal circumstances filled with despair, extreme poverty, the lack of physical freedom, an existential transcendence can manifest itself in hope, joy, and even the love of one's enemies. This existential freedom exists in such a way that people might be then motivated to peacefully pursue racial equality, cultural reform, social justice, all these things that transcend our own human capacity. They only come from God. That's what collective liberation is. The idea that this type of material and spiritual or existential freedom can be made available to all, that doesn't come from us. It has to come from a power that is greater than us. We don't have the capacity to love our enemy in our own will or in our own power. It only comes from the power of God. That does not mean we ignore the oppression. It does not mean that we work against it. Part of the idea is what Nelson Mandela was talking about when he said, the liberation of South Africans is not complete without the liberation of the Palestinians. It's the same idea. None of us are free until all of us are free. So on this Sabbath day, I leave us with this verse from 2 Corinthians 3:16 and 17. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord, there is freedom. May the Spirit of the Lord be with us. May there be freedom in our souls here in Palestine and on all the earth. In the name of Christ, amen.